Good evening. My name is Tony Clark, and I am a member of the My Brother's Keeper Task Force here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm excited to be here today. Today, we have brought together a group of distinguished guests who will help us think pragmatically as we move forward into a new year, but also in terms of a new way of thinking. We assembled a great group, and I will give you, I'll list them, and then we'll talk a little bit about tonight's conversation, and we'll get to a conversation. So thank you for being here. I'm excited to be a part of this process. We have with us Elijah Booker. Elijah Booker is a lifelong Cambridge resident, a graduate of Cambridge Public Schools, and a recent graduate of Northeastern University. As a student, Elijah was very involved in his community, serving on the executive board of the Northeastern Black Student Association and Students Against Institutional Discrimination. Throughout his career, Elijah has sought out opportunities where he could give back to Cambridge and is passionate about making a positive impact for kids of color in the Cambridge community. Recently, Elijah co-organized a Cambridge rally that happened this past June that brought over 3,500 residents throughout the city of Cambridge. Thank you for being here, Elijah. We also have with us Ernesto, I get that right, Ernesto? E-Rock Arroyo Montano. Okay. He is a proud father of three, a wonderful speaker, artist, cultural organizer, educator, and he is one of our elders. He's a queer Boricua raised in Boston, Mass, and a founding member of the radical award-winning hip-hop group Foundation Movement, with whom he has been blessed to facilitate workshops to perform around the world. What's extraordinarily important about having E-Rock here, who's done work in South Africa, Palestine, has been awarded the Assata Shakur Award, is that he's going to help us contextualize not only what we should do here in Cambridge, but also how should we look at the issues of importance regionally. So thank you for being with us, E-Rock. In addition, we have Leset Williams. Leset, like Elijah, is a graduate of Cambridge Public Schools and is a lifelong resident of Martha's Vineyard as well as Cambridge. So we're claiming you both places, all right, Leset? She's particularly passionate about closing the achievement gap and opportunity gaps. In her 10 plus years of working with youth, she has seen resources continue to dwindle, and she's been on the front lines, not only here in Cambridge, but also in Martha's Vineyard, looking at issues, many of which we'll discuss this evening. Leset is a proud graduate of Xavier University of Louisiana, the only historically Black Roman Catholic university in the country, and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology with a double minor in biology and chemistry. We also have with us, we weren't able to get his bio, but our brother Isaac Yablo, who is the graduate of Howard University and recently finished your doctorate at UMass. Is that correct?
I'm on the way to it. I'm on the way to it.
We're going to put it out there in existence. I just want to be very clear. I'm a Morehouse graduate, so it's going to be a little difficult talking to someone from Xavier and Howard, but I'm going to try to do my best this evening. And lastly, but not least, and one of the reasons, and I don't want to put too much pressure on her, is that our conversations with MBK started essentially, obviously we're all in our bedrooms or in some cases our living rooms. In this case, I've been dispatched to my office because my 8-year-old doesn't want to hang out with me. Really kind of we're curated because we felt as though conversations of authenticity weren't happening in the chambers of City Hall and also within our folks in our school committee. And there was one particular speaker, I remember this like yesterday, who really spoke up. And part of, I don't want to put too much pressure on, as I said, but our representative, Marjorie Decker, is currently serving her 4th term in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, representing the 25th Middlesex District. Before joining the House of Representatives, Representative Decker served 7 terms on the Cambridge City Council, where she was the youngest woman ever elected to the council. Representative Decker has deep roots in the Cambridge community. Growing up in public housing in Cambridge, Representative Decker was the first in our family to graduate from high school at Cambridge and Latin. She then went on to graduate with honors from UMass Amherst and earned a master's degree at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in 2007, focusing on human rights and children. During the past 20 years, our representative has earned the reputation of being a lightning rod for speaking truth to power. She has a history of advocating for her and find legislation that addresses the roots of poverty, strongly supporting civil rights, affordable housing, organized labor, early childhood education, and the environment. Her commitment to social justice began in her days as a Cambridge City councilor, where she changed the political conversation and helped rethink how the community comes together around domestic violence. And one of the things that this work, around these conversations, is kind of taking, while national conversations are critically important, we want to go from local to national versus being so just so fixated on the national conversation. And as I mentioned earlier briefly, it was a conversation in which our representative got on a call, one of our Zoom meetings that we used to hold on Wednesday evenings, and her voice was a pleasant voice, particularly as we're confronting COVID and a number of other things, not only in our city, but our nation. And I think she provided a common sense approach. So these conversations and why this work started was really about bringing to the forefront, having straight, direct, common sense conversations that hopefully will lead to the transformation of radical policy that is pragmatic in form. So I'm excited about being here. As I mentioned earlier, we have a little bit of time, not enough, and we will be here every month, God willing, to begin these conversations. And hopefully you guys not only hold us accountable, you hold your elected officials as well, okay? And so I think we have a video to start us off with to build context and just to let folks know this work started because we didn't want to end where Elijah had began in his bio. We led a rally, which was led by young people like Elijah and Nico Emack, and it's critically important that we continue this work. So we're excited about this conversation. I'm nervous, part of his excitement, and so hopefully Elijah and his beautiful smile will take the pressure off all of us. So Calvin, do you want to cue us up with the context of what we're going to be looking at today with the video?
What a difference a term makes. In 2016, our collective political life and sensibilities were turned upside down. The nation woke to see Nazis and white supremacists marching in the streets.
You can see the silver 2010 Dodge Challenger barreling down the hill toward a sea of targets with little time to react.
And a president giving a much less than full-throated endorsement for the rule of law.
Very fine people on both sides.
We saw the moral horrors of children being caged at the border.
Kids are being kept in cages.
And then the unspeakable, a lynching, played out on our TV sets and mobile devices for all to see. We saw the people rise in a worldwide push for justice. And all of that before COVID-19, a virus that effectively brought the country to heel, showed a display of stunning incompetence.
I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
And further illuminated the racial disparities in the healthcare system.
It really hurts my heart to see the effects of COVID-19 on the community.
As we rebound from one of the most contested elections in the country's history, we're left with division, mistrust, and misinformation. The question is, where do we go from here?
So I want to start posing that question to you, Representative Decker. Where do we go from here? And can I ask folks to put themselves on mute as we want to be able to hear everyone? Yes.
First, I want to say thank you, Tony, for having me. Secondly, I just need to get out of this way because I can't do a private chat. It just makes my heart sing to see E-Rock here. So I wish I could just reach out into the screen and like hug you. So this is like a long friendship here. So thank you for bringing us together. Where do we go from here? I don't think I have any more of the answers that anyone on this panel doesn't have already, right? So it really is, it's always about like who is in office has always mattered. It has always mattered. And voting is never the only thing that you do in a democracy. It's the first thing you do. And then being an active citizen has always required us to be active, right? So not only do you vote for us, but then you actually have to hold us accountable. And it's not necessarily because elected officials don't want to be held accountable, but there's a lot of things that come our way, right? There's just, there's a lot of needs in our community. There's a lot of constituencies, a lot of stakeholders. And there is that saying, the squeaky wheel, right, gets the attention or whatever it is. That's a part of it. But the other thing, there's a lot of important things that we're looking at. And as active citizens, we need to make sure that our elected officials always understand what's important to us, and going beyond that, that the lenses that they are using, or that I am using as an elected official, that I understand. So for me, for those who know me, my lenses are always about anti-poverty work, because my experience is growing up in poverty. A lot of my family still lives in poverty. This is not an academic thing for me, right? So it's always about policies we make. Is this harming people? Is it hurting people? Is it building resiliency? And is it empowering people, right? So those are my questions. I also know that I'm limited. I then have to check myself and say, okay, I can talk about poverty. Now, how is this impacting immigrants? How is this impacting people of color? That is for me to do some work on. And it's also to make sure that I'm in communication and engaged with communities that are being impacted. So I think where we go here is, we have seen people rise up. We have seen young people really tired of waiting for the adults who are in mostly in positions of power to get it right, and who've been right up there. I can tell you, one of the most powerful bills that I passed was on common sense gun ownership, and it was young people that were just not letting up. They were not just organized, they were not just walking out of schools, they were on the phones and they were texting their elected officials, they were in our face, and they were organizing. I mean, I just think that what we are seeing is that when we don't keep moving, and we don't keep that synergy going with our elected officials, and keep all of us on our toes to always ask ourselves, are we getting it right? And what does that mean? Then we're in trouble. So I think, where do we go from here? That's my piece of it. There's a lot of other people here who have a lot more to that, and I'll keep adding to that, but that's the first piece.
Thank you. So E-Rock, you sit in a unique position, right? Coming, hailing from a family that is really, politically rooted, right? While you at the same time understand the nuances of politics, but also understand the importance of activism, right? So how do activists, in the most, organic way, push on our elected officials who we are excited to be with, and if they were with us right now, we'd hug them, right? But how do we push on our elected officials to be more authentic in their approach to common folk?
Appreciate you. Thank you for having me. One of the things, and shout out everyone on this panel. It's really good to see folks. Good to see you, Marjorie. One of the things I wanted to just clarify on the intro is, I'm definitely not an elder, but I am an aspiring elder, and okay. I'm older than my children. In terms of this question, like for me, in terms of like electoral politics, there's a reason I'm not in it. And it is something that I feel knowledgeable about. I've organized in it. I've been in this for a minute. I'm one of those ask about me people. What I've seen in this situation right now, it's imperative for me to be like, okay, when I speak to your question, it's like, what have I noticed? And I have noticed that there's two things that come to mind, but one of them is a complete crisis of imagination, a complete crisis of connection, and a lack of, because of that, compassion, empathy, understanding, like the things that come with connection and imagining a possibility that could be different from the one that we have our political, some activists are elected. I happen to be of the school of Chuck Turner, and my father, some are. And some organizers are elected. Some are advocates, educators. Some are advocating for people who are not advocating for human rights, right? So I'm like, where do we draw the line? The line has to be drawn at human rights. That's like a line in the sand. If you're saying, I don't believe people should have human rights, you are my opposition. So it becomes a conversation of, if you are saying, I believe people have human rights, and we don't necessarily agree with how we're going to get to that, then we can start having conversations that include imagination, connection, and with the politicians or elected folks. What I've noticed, and this is, yeah, it's a good question. You know, I stand on the shoulders of my father, the first ever elected Latino in the state of Massachusetts, Felix Arroyo. And because of him, I could see further, right? I stand on his shoulders, not on his back or his neck. And so on those shoulders, I could see like, oh, word, thanks, Boppy, for the work you did. And what I've seen when we elect people, folks that come from us, people that come from community, people we get behind, there is this kind of thing that doesn't happen because it's not necessarily intuitive and it's not necessarily something people have a lot of conversation around. We elect someone to go advocate for us. And when we do, we often go, okay, you know, peace, good luck with that. And most of the time what happens is they are walking in rooms that are adversarial, that aren't necessarily pushing for human rights, that are getting lost in a crisis of imagination. And what happens is, like, I'll say real quick anecdotally, my mother was a disciplinarian, Boston public school teacher for 36 years. She's on point. I love her. And she was a super disciplinarian human. She still remains that. And I remember, like, you know, if we were going to go outside to play, we had to do our homework, our cleaning, all of this stuff had to happen. And my sister, Anna, she was the oldest. So me and my brother, there's 5 of us, but at the time, me and my brother, the 2 of us, would be like, hey, Anna, can you ask mommy if we can go outside and play? And we knew that this might be a point of contention because we didn't clean and we didn't do our homework yet. So my sister's going down the hallway and she turns the corner and my mother's in the kitchen cooking, like grinding for us because she loves us. She turns around and she's like, what? And already we're like, oh no, this is an adversarial moment. And my sister's like, hey, can we go outside and play? And my mother's like, did you finish everything you had to do? And me and my brother, I remember we ran down the hallway. We ran back to our rooms. So we elected my sister to advocate for us. And the minute somebody said to my sister, what? We were out. So the point of that is when we put, because often the people I vote for don't win. But when we put people in and they do win, and there are people that we feel we can work with, have places where we converge, what does it look like to show up with them when they are making the demands so that the people on the other side see that when they go, you in what army? We'd be like, what's up? And in those moments, what I've seen in organizing, as someone that's organized, when you fill that room up, people listen. When you make those calls, people listen. Now, this isn't the world I live in right now. I'm not, electoral politics is not the be all end all. And I'd love to have conversations outside of that world. But I do know that in that world, when we're in it, we have to think about, like, if this is our person, how are we rocking with the team? What does the we look like? And the spaces in between the we. And I think that requires a lot of ego work on people whose name go on the flyer. And it requires a lot of, like, organizing in the conversation around community distrust, lack of imagination, and not necessarily even having a strategy. We play a lot of scrimmages. And what happens with a scrimmage is when you lose, you just pick up a new team. But we're not creating teams that are going, hey, we lost this game. How do we get ready for the next one? And so we keep coming back to it. And so for me, it's a matter of how are we building that consistency with each other, holding each other accountable, and loving each other in our faces, what James Baldwin would call critical love. How am I being like, hey, I disagreed with that vote? Love you. It ain't over. You're not exiled. I'm not telling you to walk the plank. But what I'm saying is I disagreed with that vote. This is why. How do we move through this? Are you, you know, so I think having these conversations and being able to spark a dialogue that actually is generative and not just contentious and doesn't create what it is that ultimately we want, which for me is liberation for all people and human rights. So ultimately, that's the end result goal, and that's going to take a lot of work.
Thank you. To that point, so E-Rock mentioned the word reimagination, but he also mentioned something, an author who I love as well, James Baldwin, in Critical Love. So Leset, being a native of Cambridge, although you're, you know, native of Martha's Vineyard as well, I want us to kind of reimagine and have some critical love towards our hometown of Cambridge, particularly, like, how can our city reimagine itself, and at the same time, particular, how should, if you were to give an advice to the city council and or school committee around the idea of critical love and reimagination, what would that look like?
I think it has to start with openness, being open to what hasn't been done, being open to changing what has been done. If there is no openness, you can't have that conversation. you know, when Iraq was talking about, you know, the opposition, you know, one of my friends, she's the reason why I started kneeling on the vineyard, and her partner would have daily conversations with the opposition. He might have been trying to get them to change their mind, but at the core, he was just trying to understand where they were coming from. He had that openness to have that conversation with the opposition. So in terms of Cambridge, in order for Cambridge to be reimagined, the politicians, whether they were elected or not, have to have that openness and that willingness to have those uncomfortable conversations in order to really create change. Without it, it's not going to happen.
Awesome. Elijah, so you mentioned in your bio, the rally in which you and Nico Emack, who I see is on this call, were instrumental in putting together. Next week, many of us will celebrate the holiday, you know, Christmas, and if you celebrate Christmas, and that, however, the family of George Floyd will celebrate the 7th month in which he was executed. Let's talk, you know, I want you to kind of give us some context on how has the world changed or stayed the same as it relates to the conversation around policing since May 25th, 2020?
It's an interesting and tough question, but I will obviously do my best with it. I think that we've been able to add more attention to the, I guess, glaring problems that we as people of color have already acknowledged. We've known this in our blood and our DNA since we're probably 5 years old. If you see a cop car, I still get the immediate sigh of, not sigh of relief, but the very opposite. I get nervous, I get tensed up. I might be driving and I see a cop car and I get nervous. I didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing that I did that could have reacted or created somebody to come and get me. But that's the internalized fear. And I hate saying the word fear, but the fear I have, even as a 25-year-old that has been straight-edged and done everything right. So I think even with our protests and what we've seen not only here, but in Minnesota and in Seattle and Portland, is that we've been able to communicate maybe the 1% to 2% that this is an issue. Now that this is an issue that, we're actually being killed and slain in the street. Like, we've been telling you for 20 years. We've been telling you since Rodney King. We've been telling you since Martin Luther King. We've been telling you since a letter from a Birmingham jail and the ballot of the bullet. Like, these are issues that seem to just be being able to be communicated 1% to 2% to the populace. Now, do I think these things are dramatically changed? No, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Where do we go from here? Is we have to acknowledge that throughout the last 20 to 40 to 60 years, why even that slogan of Make America Great Again is just so blasphemous. I can't ever pick out a point in time in any aspect of housing, whether that's food insecurity, whether that is education, that the whole populace has been able to rejoice in not only the diversity of the country, but where's the actual inclusion and where's the actual equity? So when we go back to the issue of policing, it's great that we have these understandings of, all right, we're not going to kneel on somebody's neck, like a basic human right that Iraq said. Like, these are things that are completely outlawed. Like, we're asking for the bare minimum. We're asking to be respected. So if we're still asking to be respected at this point, I, as somebody that has studied a very big Malcolm X fan, though I do not let that affect my political endeavors, I'll say that I can't applaud minor progress, knowing how far we have to go. So I have a lot of friends that are becoming cops in Cambridge police. I'm going to have those conversations like Leset said, and like Marjorie said, and like Iraq said, and I know that Isaac will definitely expand upon for sure. And knowing Isaac, I can't be satisfied with progress, knowing that we have still so much far to go. So with it, I'm glad that we've been able to spark the brain that's changed the world. Like, I could be the idea that sparks the brain that changes the world, but I can never be satisfied understanding that the marginal gratitude that somebody might feel that might not have this color in this skin, or might not be a person of color, part of the LGBT community that is unfairly targeted, that that things have really been different or changed. It usually happens for 2 to 3 months, we become woke, and then everything's back to normal. Everything has a reset. It's like a body. It's like your normal bodily function. Everything kind of goes back to homeostasis. So until I see actual change, I'm going to be happy that the populace is seeing it. Not only do I need them to see it, I need them to acknowledge it, then put action and practice into actually changing systematic racism, particularly in things like policing, housing, and education.
Thank you. So Isaac, Elijah mentioned a phrase that I think is often disregarded sometimes in Cambridge, because it's this idea that it's not as bad as other places, and folks should feel as though because it's not as bad as other places, that individuals, to Elijah's point, don't experience internalized fear, right? If you could talk to us a little bit about how a place like Cambridge, despite its advertised utopian feel, it still may not, lend for particularly Black and brown folks to live in a space where they don't have internalized fear. They're still dealing with their internalized fear, even in a liberal basin like Cambridge. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces. Booker, it's great to see you. So yeah, I want to speak on it kind of from two different angles. The first angle would be kind of growing up in Cambridge, being born and raised in Cambridge, having a lot of experiences in Cambridge, but also leaving Cambridge to go to my undergrad institution of Howard. I'm a big Howard guy, and it's good to see you, Mr. Clark Morehouse. You already know, but
so what I learned at Morehouse, friends don't let friends go to Howard, but you'll be my friend today.
It's all good.
All right.
What I would say is that Cambridge, what it really does is it really blinds you in a lot of ways. So obviously it's relatively small city. I don't know how many people reside in Cambridge anymore, but it's still very sectioned off by neighborhood. So depending on the neighborhood that you come from, you may or may not see things that other people in other neighborhoods do not see. And so I think that that being in such a small place, but there being such like a blind over some of the real life experiences that people have in Cambridge, that's really where a lot of the issues lie. And then once you leave Cambridge, as I said, Cambridge kind of, I love Cambridge, it's my hometown. It's kind of like a fairy tale world where as soon as you leave Cambridge, you enter the real world where things are not as cushioned as they are in Cambridge, if you will. Like when I went to Washington, DC, it was like reality hit me, right? And then the biggest reality check for me was coming from a place like Cambridge where, I didn't even know where, I left Cambridge and I thought, like, an example was I thought weed was legal everywhere, right? Like I didn't know that people could get arrested for things like that. Right. And then you go somewhere else and it's like, this is the cold hard reality of what it means to be a person of color in inner city America. Right. So I think for that angle, Cambridge, as I said, it's great, but it also kind of cushions people and kind of prepares them in this kind of fairy tale world that isn't necessarily the reality. Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Decker, in a December 1st Washington Post article, Alicia Graza of Black Lives Matter and others were quoted as saying, the Biden administration, a senior official in the Biden administration transition committee has stated to them that there is not an immediate need to meet with organizers such as from Black Lives Matter, the Dream Defenders and others within the first 100 days. That's not a priority. Outside of not maybe having read the article or not, what do you believe elected officials' roles should be in meeting with organizers from groups like Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, and other organizations of the such? Should that be a priority of electeds?
Bless you.
Yeah, of course it should. And honestly, I haven't read the article and I'm surprised that they would be, even if they thought that they'd be dumb enough to say that. It should be a it should be a priority during the campaign. It should be a priority during the transition. And I think that this storm that we have come into with COVID, which has paralyzed our communities and our families in many ways, it's also, been this curtain that's opened up to say, look, everybody's suffering, but here, take a look, not everybody's suffering equally, right? And that is what, there's no turning away from that. People, of course, can still turn away from that and still live in their bubble of privilege. But what we know is that because of systemic racism, because of white supremacy, we know that income inequality white supremacy has always meant that people are living very unequal lives in this country. And the system was designed for that, right? It was designed to make sure that a small group of people always did really well, and that the rest of us actually constantly had obstacles for not getting enough of what we need. So I don't know why that they would say that, in particular with the Black Lives Matter movement, of the energy that I think has, one, first of all, came into the Democratic Party. I don't think without Black Lives Matter, the Democratic Party could have been as energized, as organized as it has been. So that's very clear. So, and I think I can go off on the things that we all know, right? First of all, any Black woman leading an organization for any Democratic elected official, someone you want to be talking to, because that is who saved the country, that is who has saved the Democratic Party. So I don't know what that thinking is about. I'm very focused on sort of what we're doing in the state. I'm excited to have people who believe in science and medicine leading the country. But it just seems odd. And I gotta say, I can't believe that that's gonna be true.
Yeah.
Whether it's the president or people in the administration, I can't believe that they're not already having those conversations. And Tony, I wanna also challenge you to challenge us to think about, there's been a lot of things said here about looking at Cambridge. I served on the local level for 14 years here. I still care deeply and am impacted by decisions being made at the local level. And it's interesting to hear Isaac talk about what it means to move out of Cambridge and see, wow, there's a part of our community that I think as Cambridge kids, right, we feel very proud about. But there's also, and Elijah, talked about this, that, who you are in this community, even in Cambridge, Elijah walks out of the house as a young Black man, that still puts him at a much higher risk than anyone else who walks out of their house who's a young white man, right? And how do we have conversations about in Cambridge that talk about, when we talk, somebody mentioned something about like the opposition, looking like talking, I think Leset, when you were talking about your friend's husband talking to the opposition, I think in Cambridge, it gets so messy and so just complicated about what does it mean to talk about the opposition? Because we all care about like racial justice, social justice, economic justice. Now, start having those conversations at the very micro level now with the Board of Zoning Appeals or the Planning Board or the Historic Commission, and start talking about how does equity actually, what does equity look like in Cambridge, and who gets to decide how much equity and too much equity and where equity physically is in each neighborhood. I mean, that's for me where it gets really, it's the most beautiful, messy Cambridge problem. When you have a lot of people who have shared values, yet those values don't actually lead us to the same places and the same decisions that would be more inclusive and actually bring more equity to more people who've been excluded.
Great point. So Leset, when you think, let's kind of build off of the representative's points, the various number of them. Well, let's talk about I want to kind of play the semantics game, equity and equal, right? Does Cambridge suffer from having the tough conversation around equal, or is it easier to have the conversation in equity? And what I mean by that is in terms of we constantly have these conversations around equity, we don't have to have the tough conversation around the fact that school A and school B are far, far apart from possibly being equal, at least in possibly even my lifetime, right? We can, folks who are from here, even folks, from Boston, across the river, we know when we're 7, 8 years old, what are the good schools, right? And unfortunately, we're probably in that same space. So when we think about phrases like anti-racism in a city like Cambridge that are used sometimes to nauseam, is it easier to say equity versus equal Leset? And what work will need to be done so that we can have the real conversation, I like to say, around making things equal?
So I think that equity and equality are often confused with each other. And so I think that it is important to know which term you're referring to in order to have a productive conversation. Equality just means everybody gets something. So if I baked a pie and I've got 6 slices, that means 6 people are going to get a piece of it. Equity means that I'm going to distribute that pie based on who needs how many pieces of it. So equity means that if Tony, you need 1 slice, you're going to get 1. If E-Rock needs 3, he's going to get 3. If Elijah needs 2, he's going to get 2. If Isaac needs 1, he gets that last piece. That's what equity means. So when we talk about equity in Cambridge, in terms of education, in terms of housing issues, food instability, homelessness, that's what we need to focus on. It's not everybody gets an education or everybody gets housing. It's how much does each person need? What quality education does a person need? What kind of housing does a person need? That's the conversation. And so until we have the definition down, we can't have the conversation. And so I love equality, but I'm about equity because that's what we're working towards. But in order to move to equity, we have to start with diversity. That has to be the beginning of the conversation. And a lot of people and organizations think that that's the end goal. If you think that diversity is what you're working towards, you're already far behind. But in addition to equity and diversity, there's got to be inclusion and a sense of belonging. And that piece, the belonging, is a concept that was recently introduced to me by Dr. Darnisa Amati Jackson. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. People have to feel like they belong and feel like they're included in order to work towards equity.
Okay, let's push on that. I want to push on that a little bit, Elijah. You're a big brother. You often talk about your siblings and their experiences with the schools. And let's spend a little bit of time around, although in the clip in the beginning, we didn't explicitly mention our schools, right? Or schools in general, right? And I want to thank E-Rock's mom for her service. Like you, my mom's a retired educator as well. And so one of the things that I'm fascinated about is that in terms of COVID has, in a lot of ways, exasperated, in some ways exposed other aspects of our education system, right? And it's kind of put on, hopefully it's put a light on the fact that, you know, the semantics around equal and equality and all those things, we can throw it out the window, but what has COVID shown you with the respect to our education system, either nationally, locally, in the state? I know you're doing some great work with the representative. Maybe you can have a lens of the state, but also particularly also a lens of Cambridge. What does COVID put a light on with respect to our education system?
Sure. I guess I'll try to attack all three. Personally, as a big brother helping my brother and sister with virtual learning, it's been tough. I think we can all speak to that have all been parents or have younger siblings or younger individuals in our lives. And it realizes how much preparation matters. And as a person that just graduated, I used to think, oh, I could just get through all my essays and I'll be able to procrastinate. I'll do that. And you can't do that when you have lives at stake, when you have those that are trying to mature and learn what 1 + 2 is. It's a question I answer probably 17 times a day, which I'm fine with doing. It's perfectly fine. But it comes to a point where I realized that locally and having the conversations that we did on those constant Zoom issues, that there were just a lot of holes, respectfully, in our Cambridge public school systems. There wasn't a robust foundation for virtual learning like there should be. There were parents coming on to Zoom meetings every week, week after week, like, I don't know how to even sign onto the laptop. I don't know how to check to make sure that my son or my daughter is making sure that they're doing their work. Are they going to graduate? Are they going to get to the next grade? So there were so many unanswered questions, and this is not to put too much unnecessary heat on the local officials, but it ended up becoming very frustrating trying to help my mom, who also has to do her own job, that there wasn't a straightforward plan of how parents that are also working at home now have to manage being a teacher and then also a working for their actual job. In the state level, from just the numbers that I've seen, not only just virtual learning in big cities like Boston, Lawrence, Lowell, have they had issues, but just childcare after. So do parents feel safe bringing and putting their kids into school, but then who's going to watch them? I know a lot of, particularly people of color, low income people, might be working 2 jobs or might not have the ability to come and pick up their student or their child right after 2. So then just even that trust factor of, do I even send them to school? Do I have them stay at home and do virtual learning with the big brother or big sister? And then how much learning and how much nurturing are they actually getting? So it goes back to the conversation that you guys have all brought up, but especially the set of where is the equity that lies in that? there are already disparities in our education system off the rip. Like, we acknowledge that between reading, math, and writing skills. So what I've seen in this pandemic is it's only exacerbated, like we've seen, where we're going to see wide gaps, much wider gaps, where individuals that might have been able to pay for a tutor and pay for other services, there's certain kids of color, there's certain low income kids that were already behind, and now they're going to be more behind because they haven't had access to those services. So from the state and the city level, that's where I've been most disappointed, because there hasn't, whether those services are there or not, which they could have been. Like, I'm just fresh new to this job, particularly in the state, as well as just the work that we've been doing in MBK, and I obviously can't know everything, but the communication aspect and piece hasn't been there. So a lot of parents have been learning about possible outlets 2 to 3 weeks late, 4 weeks late, maybe in the summer. I don't think the plan of what actually was going to occur for Cambridge Public Schools was really rolled out until the summertime. What virtual learning, what we were actually going to do with that to the summertime. So it's been very frustrating, challenging, as somebody that also mentored youth in the summer, when I'm talking to 16 to 18-year-olds who have no idea that they were supposed to be taking 4 classes this year. You know, like, it's a lack of communication, which in all relationships in life and all things that we do in life, that is the first barrier. So seeing that in a state and local level, that is what's been most frustrating, knowing that the ones who are going to suffer the most are the ones who always continue to suffer the most, who always have to have the burden put upon them. And now they're going to be expected to somehow rise above it. I know that Representative Decker has been pushing to have a postponement of the MCAS. I can speak honestly for myself. I never did good at MCAS. I'm a terrible test taker. I think a lot of us, maybe our Morehouse and Howard brothers, might be a little different. Y'all might be great test takers. I know it costs a lot to get into those schools. But for me, I was a terrible test taker. The only reason why I got in was good grades. I was able to stack practice and study. So to have pressure on kids that are already going through a numerous amount of mental health issues, food insecurity issues, and just what the next day lies and how that even, what to tell them what the next day can be. I've just been massively disappointed. And then nationally, with our Secretary of Education, with Ms. DeVoe or Betsy or whatever her pleasant name is, I seems very forgettable at this point. There's just been a lack of leadership, and with a lack of leadership, you don't have direction, and that's what we've seen not only from her but from our whole government at this point in time, and why the changing of guard in January and February will be massively important.
You said something, Elijah and Leset. I'm going to kind of piggyback on with some of the things that both of you guys said. I want to bring this to you, E-Rock. One theme that you mentioned, I think 3 times in your response, Elijah, was the word communication. And so I'm curious, from your particular position, E-Rock, when we think about COVID, and particularly, I want you to particularly look at communities of color, right? One of the things I'm actually going to give a statement, and I want to maybe get your take on it. I have found that the communication with communities of color is not new. It's always been disjointed. It's always been fragmented. But in COVID, in a lot of ways, it's exasperated at the national level, at the municipal level, and at the state's level. I'm just curious, in terms of, from your perspective, how do you think we use this moment to shift the way in which we communicate with marginalized communities?
Wow. So thank you. And I'm just actually engrossed in the conversation and appreciating y'all. I had so many thoughts on, like, even a Biden thing referenced earlier. We replaced a white supremacist, fascist capitalist with a capitalist, neoliberal, white progressive supremacist. So what that means to me is that, like, now's the time. If we say what's the time now, it's let's be very clear about who Biden is and what he stands for. And so when I think about communication, like when you ask communication, how do I bring that in? One thing that we've revealed, when you said exposed, you were right on. And it's a story that we know over and over again until we figure this out for ourselves as a whole. The emperor has no clothes on. The Wizard of Oz is just a white dude who doesn't know what he is doing. We are asking these folks to give us answers they don't have, does not necessarily benefit them, and yet somehow they get behind the curtain, and then we understand that somehow the Wizard of Oz knows what's happening. And so when I look at this stuff, I know one thing for sure. With my remote schooling, I have 3 children who are remote schooling. I apologize to them weekly for us not getting this right. I say to them, this isn't it. I know in a few years, I'm going to sit down with them and be like, I'm sorry I let you stay on that computer for 5 hours of the day. I hope you understand that we didn't know what we, So when I think about that communication, I think about another thing is like, I've lived in 2 other cities. I'm a Boston born and bred Puerto Rican. I've lived in Brooklyn and I've lived in Cambridge. And one of the things that I've noticed and what my observation, which for me is like an awareness of what's going on around us, because sometimes we play make pretend in a way that's, when I say we have a crisis of imagination, we don't have a crisis of like delusional, like cult leadership, like letting people dictate the conversation. And so in communication, so often they'll be like, hey man, I want to talk about this blue water bottle. What do you think about this blue water bottle? And you're like, that's not the conversation we want to have. And so they get to actually they get to be like, this is the conversation we're going to have. And we have to find ways of being like, one of the things I know about folks in power, first of all, often is that they often fear mirrors. And they don't get mad at us for the reflection. They get mad at us for having the audacity to put the mirror up. How dare you reflect back to me the reality that you're actually seeing? How can you actually say we don't know what's happening? And another, like what I think about when I think about communication, and it's a misunderstanding for me that I've seen, is when I say white progressive supremacy, I'm talking about white progressive supremacists who believe that because they know race is a problem, because they admit it's a problem, because they know that these things are interconnected, that intersectionality is a problem, that somehow they have done the work to excavate the racism that is the poison that colonized in your education, in the way you were taught to communicate to Black and brown folks, in the way you felt entitled. Just because we agree on a particular policy doesn't mean you actually know how to have a conversation with me. And most of the time, those conversations are disingenuous, or at the very least, like arrogant. They come from a place of like, play your position. I know what you need, rather than I actually don't know. And I think that's one of the things that's missing a lot of the times in elected halls, because we elect people to speak with conviction, and it's a beautiful thing. But to have a moment to reflect back and say, I don't know. And that's why we need to have these conversations. That's why we have to have an ideation. That's why we have to say, what can we imagine? I promise you, from having conversations, not only with children and teachers, that the support is not there on so many, like what Elijah was saying. When Elijah was saying the support in terms of mental, in terms of food insecurity, all that kind of stuff, it's the realest thing happening right now. And we know it to be true. Because we know it to be true, then we have to keep reframing. We have to, every time the conversation attempts to make it look like we've somehow gotten to the place that we were trying to get to, we have to be like, hey, excuse me, I don't want to talk about the blue water bottle right now. I want to talk about what the reality is, that we are being impacted by greedy capitalism, white supremacy, and these policies that continue to kind of put us as an afterthought. I know you know, Tony, it's more of a like, how do we have this conversation out loud that says, the way you are talking to me right now, I'm fully aware that you think you know the right way to that this is not a conversation that feels like it's inviting actual critical, like, how do we do this better? And I think that a lot of people get caught up in selling whatever it is that a lot of people like to pretend they know the emperor has clothes on. And like, I'll just end with that. Like, it's really like the communication has to be very clear. Like, this is a country, like Elijah said, and I heard from folks say that has 400 years of colonization, abuse, all of these things. And it's not gone. It's, there are babies in cages right now we don't know where their parents are. Right. That intro you put on hit me in my gut, hit me in my throat, hit me emotionally, spiritually. It hurts. And so what are we doing with that? How are we saying, yo, beyond the feeling, which is important, how are we dealing with what this is evoking in us so that we're excavating this very real idea that somehow white folks got the answers when they really don't? And that's not a blanket statement of, I'm saying we as a whole don't really know what is next. And we need to be able to have those conversations. We can regurgitate, shout out Howard, we can regurgitate Kwame Ture and Stokely and Ella Baker, and we could talk about what we've learned from them. But how are we applying that right now in this moment? This is a a moment in which we get to reinvest And I think we need to do that by calling out people. I'm really tired of people getting away with getting to be friendly. It appears to me that Governor Baker is friendly. So I've talked to people who disagree with me who are friendly, and your policy is supporting something that is detrimental and actually killing some of us. And I think in that extent, in the communication, it becomes, let's be clear. Because I don't want to play this game of make pretend and make believe with you, where you are going to now tell me the solution to a problem that you've continued to not only create, but evade accountability for your participation in its creation. And that's not just something you can do because you've had an aha moment or you've woken up. And I actually appreciate those people who are constantly being like, I got to do my work. I have to do my gender work. I have to do my work. I have to show up in the room and be like, in what ways do I have to sacrifice and listen in different ways? How do I show up in this moment? If I feel angry, how do I show that? If I feel sad, how do I move through that vulnerability in this moment? And how do I say, yo, it hurts? Actually, it's really actually hurts. And the reality is that when you're dealing with that kind of emotion, the communication, when we don't even trust y'all, and when I say y'all, it's just like y'all. When we have this inability to trust y'all, then the actual onus is on those people who say they are serving the community to do the work to hear us. It is not on us to continue to advocate for some of the things. Like, it's very frustrating, and I see faces nodding and I'm going to chill back, but I think there's a frustration there where we keep doing the same thing, where we keep going to the folks who don't know and being like, why won't you tell us what we're going to do next? And they don't know.
I think that's what you said, several things, but particularly the mirror. And I'm actually glad to see a mentor of mine is on here, Carolyn Hunter. I'll tell a brief story. And I joke with you, Isaac, but I actually am excited and proud that you went to that you went to Howard. I tell the story because when I was in 11th grade, actually going into my 11th grade year, I needed to do something one summer. And Carolyn Hunter brought us, I don't know if she remembers this, but she brought us over to Longfellow Hall. And we had the opportunity to listen to Derek Bell. And at that point, I had never, I'm a reader now, I love to read, but I had never finished a book. Like I would always read a book, but I never really finished a book. And he gave us his book. It was about 7 of us. And that summer, I had taken a train to a summer program to Howard University. So I went, and I knew, I'll just be honest with you, Isaac, I knew if I went to Howard, I wouldn't study. It was too much fun there, right? For me, I wasn't that focused. So, but I was there, I spent the summer there, and it was reading, Derek Bell's book, and also spending a lot of time in the library at Howard, where I learned a number of things about myself, but also I started to put up, and I think it was E-Rock had mentioned this, a mirror up to my own experiences of being a Cambridge kid, okay? And so before we go into a round where we're gonna ask the audience to put questions in the chat, your experiences as a kid from Cambridge, but also someone who's had opportunities outside of this place, has seen some things, is doing some great work as you're in your doctoral studies. I'd like you to put a mirror up to the city of Cambridge. Just put a mirror up to the city of Cambridge, and what do you see when you put that mirror up?
Well, I'll extend it even for you. So I'm a product of Cambridge. I'm a graduate of Howard. I'm an adoptee. My experience and my kind of my I'm a sociologist also, so my sociological lens I have on kind of my experience in Cambridge is very unique. But if I had to put a mirror up to the city, it would that's a funny question. Not that it's actually funny, but it's funny that you asked, just because of how real I think that people would have to get with themselves, right? Because there's a lot of, as I said before, there's a lot of great things that Cambridge produces and creates, right? But there's also a lot of things that Cambridge is very slow on, despite being the great city that it is. And that's really what I was trying to get at when I spoke at the rally that Nico and Elijah were able to graciously put together is that like we should be doing much better as a city that is so technologically advanced, that is so quote unquote diverse, that is so liberal, right? All these things that we pride ourselves on as being from Cambridge, but then it's like an application thing that E-Rock said, right? So a couple of things. This Biden situation, the way I've been describing it is like starting a fire and now we're celebrating that the fire's been put out, right? It's like, do we really celebrate about this? What came from this situation is blatant, even more blatant racism than what was there before, right? And now we're kind of settling in a situation where not too many people are happy with what we're settling with, right? And then there's also the idea about, you know, and in being adopted, I have two Caucasian parents that are also scholars, right? My mother, scholar of women and gender studies at MIT. I get into back and forth with her all the time because she is an individual that is so invested in the academic understanding of race and experiences of racism, right? That she kind of forgets, like, you're a white lady from Cambridge. Like, bro, I'm the one that has the authentic, not only like in school academic grounding in it, but also reality, like experience, you know, experiential grounding in it, right? So I appreciate what you said, E-Rock, on that, because that's a real thing. And then the last thing that I would say is, like, I've been talking to a lot of my close friends about this term of ally, right? Because it implies some sort of common ground where we're like on the same level of something. And it's like, I don't want allies, I want liberation. I don't want white people to say like, oh yeah, I feel you and I understand that. You know, I appreciate the marching, but what I really want is 400 systemic injustice to be acknowledged, not only on a theoretical and individual level, but on a systemic level, right? And it just so happens that a lot of the time when I get into these conversations, like, I don't sugarcoat anything. I don't really have a desire to get into politics, so I don't have to sugarcoat anything, right? And a lot of the times, the individuals that are able to kind of spin around these conversations are these people in positions of power, right? So I appreciate this discourse and this kind of panel that we're having about how do we advance it, because in a lot of situations, like, I appreciate Representative Decker being here, right? Because I played at Central Baseball when I was younger, Farm League, and I had your name on my back when I was running around when I was really young, right? And so I appreciate her willingness to engage in this kind of conversation, but not too many of them would, right? And so I just want to kind of, you know, end by saying thank you. I appreciate this discussion.
No, this work kind of started, to you, Representative Decker, and I'm going to open it up to questions. It started, you know, I would say not MBK started because of essentially you. I mean, it's a number. We stand on the shoulders of the Carolyn Hunters and the Frank Barnes and, you know, Laurie Lander and other folks who are on this call. But part of this work, particularly our calls, was a byproduct of feeling like there was a leadership devoid in our city, you know, just to be quite frank. And obviously, you know, we see that void nationally, and in some cases with the allies that are made internationally, right? But just curious in terms of, from your standpoint, what is leadership in this moment? Because obviously this is a new moment for all of us, but I'm just curious from where you sit, what does leadership in this moment look like?
You know, I think there's been a lot of things said here, and E-Rock has said this in many ways. For me, that's really important. When I think about leadership, it's not what people say. And I think about why having people, you know, to keep using this overused metaphor, at the table. And for me, the table is a place of decision-making and policy-making, right? I hold a very influential place where I have the vote and the confidence and the trust of people to vote in ways that use my judgment, that can save lives, can break lives. And for me, it's interesting. The place where I find a lot of tension happens to be with people who predominantly identified with being so-called far left and predominantly far left white men. That's a place where I seem to clash a little bit on social media. And for me, it's because I'm not looking for your permission. I'm not looking for you to tell me whether or not I'm progressive enough for you. Because what you say is important, but it's not nearly as important as how are you going to change things? What are the outcomes? How are people's lives like? So there's a lot, and that's what I talk about, this beautiful, messy like thing of Cambridge. We can all actually sound a lot alike, right? But that does not mean that we are on the same path and the same sense of urgency and are demanding the same outcome. And so for me, it is very visceral. So when I pass big laws, and I have, last year I was able to get rid of an archaic 20-year law that said that if you had children and you'd already started receiving government assistance and you had another child, that child would no longer receive assistance, right? It was a way to stop women on welfare from having babies, right, supposedly. And then just recently I passed something that will increase for the first time in 20 years, an increase in cash grants by 10%. I say that because both of those moments, I actually didn't get excited. The truth is, the first time I cried because, you know, Iraq, as you know, because I'm not eliminating poverty, right? I'm not getting to the roots of why people are in poverty. It's systemic why people are in poverty. And so, to be clear, I'm never satisfied, but I'm also going to be clear to not do that work would be an abject failure of leadership, because it is important that in this journey, that as a leader, any leader, whether you're a leader of an organization, elected official, that while you're trying to make these big systemic changes, and I rely on people like you, Tony, like Iraq, like Elijah, you know, like Carolyn Hunter, right? I rely on people on the outside to always make me uncomfortable and believe I'm not doing enough. The truth is, internally, I never feel like I'm doing enough, right? And that's a whole other psychological thing of growing up in poverty and all this other stuff, right? And knowing that people need far more than I will ever be able to deliver alone, right? So I will never be satisfied that I've done enough, but to not honor some of that would be a real disservice to my parents about where I've come from, and to most importantly, a disservice to what people are in need. So leadership is about really understanding, it's not what you say, because it's so easy in Cambridge. We can say Massachusetts, you can say Democrats, but in Cambridge, and to be a progressive here, it's so easy for us to sound alike. What are you doing? And I will say about leadership locally, I will say that it ebbs and flows. Who I am today, in terms of my outcomes, I might sound very similar who I am today. And Iraq has known me for a while, and I'm texting with one of your brothers right now. But the truth is, I'm probably a much better elected official than I was 18 years ago, when I was still learning and I had to fail a lot. While I was in my rhetoric, I had to fail, and then I had to learn how to do it better. But the leadership is about being committed to being a failure in front of people that you respect, and then needing to understand, how did I fail here? Who did I fail? And then what do I need to do it better? Because failing doesn't mean you should go away. It just means you need to understand it so you can do better. And I think that in a pandemic, with a state that truly has left local communities and local school districts alone, the governor has failed to provide tools to allow school districts and to allow municipalities they've had to create their own blueprints. I'm frustrated with schools, districts in Cambridge, across the state. I am frustrated. We are harming children every day with remote education. And we're afraid to talk about that because we don't want to be seen as somehow being critical of those who have to deliver education. Regardless of how we deliver it, we're also creating greater harm of isolation, anxiety, depression, but we're not giving schools and teachers the tools to feel confident, to do it differently, and to do it safely. So I just think that there's a lot of it's so easy to talk about it and get people to love you on Twitter, love you on Facebook, love you at a rally, right? I don't need to be loved. I need to know that people in positions need to feel the pain of what it means to fail if you don't get it right. That if I don't get it right, that means that the pain and suffering I care about will continue to grow. So I think that in Cambridge, I will say that we have incredible leaders who are just, for many of them, are just trying to figure this out. They need more time and experience, and they're going to be there. And then I'm seeing a lot of leaders who might not be elected, but they are leaders right now, and they're going to continue to shape. So who I was 20 years ago is not who I am today. And so some of that, I think it's important to remember that when also looking at our leaders. And Iraq said something very important. When our elected leaders go into a room and they face the opposition, right? When it's clear, and it's not always clear, they need to know that I'm either physically you're with me, or I know that spiritually and emotionally you're with me, and that's giving me power to actually keep fighting, because speaking truth to power can be a very lonely, isolating, and painful place. And when I do that, for me, it's always about, like, I tell people, I walk into, when we could walk into stores, and I would walk into Ann Taylor at the age of 48 that I am now, I still assume people think I'm in there trying to steal something, because that internally is who I am. I am still, you know, Margie Decker from Woodrow Wilson Court. That's maybe not who somebody sees at Ann Taylor, but I think leadership is about, like, having our elected officials really understand what's at stake, bringing people who have being close enough to what's at stake. When you get elected to a community and you don't actually have to worry about failing the people that you know and that love you, that's hard too. Like, when people ask me if I should run for office, I say, you have to know your community, you have to love your community, you have to be afraid of failing and looking into the eyes of people who are counting on you the most. I've said more than I need to, Tony, but
that's brilliant. And I want to just remind folks, if you have a question, we only have about 17 minutes left. Feel free to put in the chat. You know, this is a forum for you guys as well. And you had mentioned something about leadership that I want to piggyback on. Either, you know, Leset or Elijah, either you can take this, but in terms of how do we utilize this moment to galvanize new leadership? And you can define new however you see that. It could be young, it could be more women of color, our trans folk. You know, how do we utilize this moment to galvanize additional leadership?
So you can take it first. I'll go.
Okay. So the sad and unfortunate reality is that there's enough work for everybody. We all have a part to play, and we all should play our part. You know, I've had a number of these conversations for many months about, you know, why now? What's different? Why are people woke now than before? I think the pandemic plus George Floyd equals greater sense of awakening. We were all stuck in our homes, forced to watch his lynching, and it allowed people to open their eyes in ways that they were never open before. Many more people have been having these uncomfortable conversations than they've ever had before. People have lost relationships because of these uncomfortable conversations. I'm talking significant others, I'm talking friendships. However you define a relationship, they have been fractured because of these uncomfortable conversations. That's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. We all have a role to play. And so in terms of, you know, harnessing the leadership, it's what every individual person is willing to do to move the needle forward. It can't just be on one person. It can't be Black people feeling like this is our time to sit back and like watch change happen. No, we don't get to do that. It's not just on white people either to, you know, to make up for what's been done to Black people. Every single person has a part to play in making change. And it's going to take all of us. And so I remember, you know, being at Beetlebun Corner in Shellmark, which is on Martha's Vineyard, at one of our kneelings, where we would take a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and tell the story of a victim of police brutality and say their name so that they are not forgotten. And one thing I remember saying to my community members is the fact that there's a lot of work to do. There is something that each one of us can do. Check your circle of friends. If your circle of friends only looks like you, that's some work to do. Your circle of friends should look like the rainbow and not just be, you know, for me, like if all I have are Black friends, then that's a problem. I should have white friends, Latino friends, Asian friends, queer friends, because that's how I'm going to grow and learn. So that's one way that we can harness leadership, is just look at your own personal surroundings. If you have a friend who continually has problems getting a job, make a referral for them, help them get a job. If you have, you know, a neighbor that got turned down on a bank loan and you're a white person and your neighbor's Black, how about show up with them to their next appointment so that they know that they have the support? So, I mean, these are just examples of ways in which, you know, we can make change. But in terms of harnessing leadership, we all have it in us and we can all do it. It's just a matter of taking action and not sitting back and watching.
Based on what, thank you, Leset. Based on what Leset was saying, I'm going to shift it a little bit to you, Elijah, in terms, I want to be more specific in terms of, I don't want to create any ageism, but let's say, what is the agenda? Because we're seeing right now in Georgia, ironically, we have a number of folks whose birthdays did not fall, you know, they didn't turn 18 for the last election. Now they'll fall, you know, they'll be 18 to vote in this current election. And you're also seeing in terms of, there's also an ideological, pretty much a divide between young people 18 to 26 who are, you know, aligned with the Republican nominees and the other side nominees. I'm just curious from your perspective, and, you know, Isaac, you can jump in here. What is, if any, some of the agenda items of your generation that need to be put on the forefront, both at the local and possibly the national agenda as it relates to legislation?
We'd be here all night if I could go through my Twitter timeline and tell you all the major issues. But
give me top three.
I'm messing with you. Particularly loan relief. So I mean, a lot of massive students are just crumbling under debt. I know I am right now, even as fruitful as Northeastern was. They didn't pay me that much. They didn't give me that much money. So definitely debt relief, of the understanding that we are supposed to go to school to get a job to then pay back what we just took out to go to school. It's a very backward cycle that seems to trap a lot of people, and why a lot of people don't even end up going to school. So I know Nico can speak to it as well. Isaac might be able to speak to it too as well. But it is very troubling, even in a place like Cambridge, where I can only count on my hands and maybe my toes of how many friends I would deem successful after they left high school. So whether that's because they didn't want to go to college because they thought it was too much debt, maybe weren't prepared to go to college, or felt that maybe along the way through college that they weren't worthy enough. I think in talking to Ty, I think he called me and Nico diamond in the rough. There's only about 30% of us that are actually graduating and going on to careers. And that's a massive problem for the amount of debt that we're taking out, and is how fast paced the world is moving. In the blink of an eye, the rents are going up, the validation to get a job is going up. So we are almost shrinking in the ability to even push for ourselves, to move out of our own homes, to do anything for ourselves, while the very baseline and requirement for us to even get a job is almost unattainable for us. And then when we get out, the very jobs that are entry level are masters. So I barely had enough to take out for undergrad, so now I have to take out for masters too. So it just ends up becoming a very backward cycle. So that would be one. The two is just basic, and E-Rock talked about it, but just a greater understanding of basic human rights. So another one would just be housing. Can you live where you would want to live? And I know it almost is a first world problem in some aspects, but in another, a lot of kids just want to grow up where they lived. A lot of people in Cambridge are suffering and deal with challenges of that because it's just we live in a very high price market, whether that's Cambridge or Boston. So that is a challenge not only here, and kids are moving out to many different areas. Some are moving down south, some are moving upstate, because they just can't afford to live where they were able to grow up. And that's just a sad fact of the matter. It would be beautiful if we could find a way, not only here, but my friends that live in New York, my friends that live in DC, my friends that live in Georgia, to be able to come back and give back to the very community that gave so much to you. And at this point, that has become a struggle in every sense of the word. And I guess the last problem, we said three, the last problem that I guess I would be able to talk about, or I can think of, it is, I guess, a little bit more abstract, is just a sense of belonging. And I know that we talked about that, and Leset talked about that as well. Do we belong in this country? You know what I mean? It doesn't matter who you are, what you identify as, people that are people of color. Do you belong here? As a person of the LGBTQ community, do you belong here? As a white woman, as a white male, there is obviously a question of even, do they belong here? And that's why you're seeing the political polarization that we see now. There is a question of who actually belongs in this country. So as a person of color, as a Black and Spanish man, it becomes very troubling to figure out how I navigate, and I can only expand that for my friend group who is diverse, Leset, so I will take that badge of it, but who is diverse. We're all having these questions where it's like, where do I fit in a, not only in a city like Cambridge, where we very much need to hold up the mirror to ourselves, because there are very many glaring flaws, and that mirror has been cracked about for the last 25 years, speaking honestly. But how do we find a sense of belonging, and then how do we move forward? How do we understand that in a democracy, progress is slow, but with that in our leadership, that if we all become leaders and we all find a way to hold each other accountable, to have greater leadership and to be more consistent, that we can speed that process up. And I feel like that will be able to accelerate the belonging, obviously education, all the economic, social, and political issues that we are currently experiencing today.
Let's stay there for a little bit. And although we have a couple of minutes left and we would want to end with smiles, I want to push on folks a little bit. I want to bring this back to you, E-Rock. Like you, I've lived in Brooklyn, Boston, and Cambridge, obviously. But in those three places, you're hearing chants, particularly if we go back to the video we saw in the beginning, there are dissenting voices, particularly dissenting political voices, right? And oftentimes the voices of, let's say, I don't want to say the AOC wing of the party, right? But there's a progressive ethos, right? That oftentimes is drowned out. And a lot of times it's drowned out in this moment, like, just be cool, be relaxed, right? Don't do too much. And we do that even here in Cambridge, where there are voices of young people and people in general that are, I'm one of the first to be critical that Black folks matter more than bike lanes, right? But I do think that we can't ignore some of the other things that some of our bike lane brethren do and have done to organize, right? And so I want to just kind of ask you to kind of help us think about not getting so far ahead, not necessarily with the Biden administration, but so far ahead where we just ignore the dualities of the voices in any party, but particularly not shutting out our, folks who may espouse to the idea of the progressive ethos. So how do we make sure those voices aren't silenced in this moment?
Wow. Again, good question. One of the things I wanted to speak to that this speaks to, two things. One of them is a very simple question of any elected official, anyone who is a leader, anyone who is in, which we've discussed what that could look like. Anybody should be able to ask the question, how do you like to be held accountable? And they need to have an answer for that. They can't just say, oh no, I don't really like to be held accountable. That's a red flag. So like, it's a thing about that. Now, something I want to think about with the AOC wing, Ilhan, our very own Ayanna, they make me excited, right? Like I get excited by the squad. They give me a sense of joy. One of the things I don't know how to express this, so I'm going to go to a sports analogy again. So forgive me, my friends who may not be excited about a sports analogy. And I'm going to go with baseball. So we're all playing different positions, but we forget we're on the same team. So you'll see someone in left field fighting with the center fielder who's fighting with the shortstop, or everybody's trying to be at second base. But if everybody's at second base, the ball's going to drop. Or people are not hitting the cutoff, person. And I'm using this analogy because we actually get on the field and then we start fighting with each other. There's nothing more embarrassing than the same team fighting each other on the field. You might want to do that in the locker room, in the coaching. So it becomes this. Why I say this? Because I don't expect Marjorie to play the same position I play. I want Marjorie to be, you going to be in center field, Marjorie? Hold it down, catch the ball when it comes. I'm going to be in left field. Okay, I'm going to be with you. Hey, we want to say, oh, someone's at shortstop and right field. How are we recognizing the places where we converge? Draw the line at human rights. We don't have to play the same position and we are on the same team. What that means to me is how do we uplift those voices that you're saying? Because there's one of the things I learned from I love to read and shout out Derek Bell, by the way. And brilliant. Arundhati Roy told us there's actually no such thing as the voiceless. It's just that people are not listening. Everybody got something to say. Everybody's ready to have part of the conversation. And so what happens is, we have to amplify those who are deemed voiceless or make way and pass the microphone. And also be a part of the conversation when we're like, yo, hey, we in this together. How are we on the same team to get to the same place? It can't just be the charismatic, loud Puerto Rican dude. You know what I mean? Like it has to be the different people that play different positions about how we bringing them into the conversation, because introverts need love too. right? Like, how are we going to move through this way? And I think for me, it becomes amplify. So one of the things I do love about the squad is they on it. They're moving. One of the things I think is kind of what I like about your question is sometimes people forget. They just think they don't understand. They're actually outliers in that party. They are actually trying really hard to push a party that is constantly annoyed by them. That's one of the things I think we really need to remember, that like the left of the party is being taken for granted. It has been taken for granted. The root has been taken for granted. And then they go, how do we go to the center? So they don't want to uplift those voices. One of the first things that happened after that election from the Democrats was a blaming of the squad and the people like AOC and Ilhan for having the nerve to talk about Black Lives Matter, defunding police, and all the, how dare they have the audacity to speak up for those people who they're listening and amplifying and being a part of in that community. So I think for us, it's going to have to be constantly being like what I said earlier, to bring this full circle, is when we bring folks in to speak to us and we elect them and we support them and we care for them, we amplify that. And we don't do it because we hero worship. We don't do it because we believe in cult leadership. We do it because they are us and we are they, and we are on the same team. And so we need to figure out who's on the same team with us, play our positions, and keep amplifying, because the naysayers will naysay. And we are going to be like, okay, while they do that and there's a line of defense attempting to have a communication with them, we need to be over here reimagining, repositioning, recommitting, and redoing things that intrinsically, the question I'll end with is, how in our everyday lives, elected a leader, not leader, everybody on this listening, how are you living your values? How are you moving with integrity? I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier, Marjorie, of like, sometimes people got a good talk, but it's like, at the end of the day, how is your value being amplified by the decisions you're making? What are you sacrificing for our liberation? And in that question, because it's not an accusation, in that question lies the work that we all have to do. How am I doing to live my values? So tonight when I go to bed and my head hits the pillow, I can be like, nailed it, you know?
So right before we get out of here, I have two more questions. One for Isaac and one for Representative Decker. But as you were speaking, E-Rock, it made me think about a question that I've had, within me for many years, is that in a place like Cambridge, but I'm certain this is a national issue, is that, to you, Isaac, there are a number of initiatives and programs and projects that are going on in Cambridge. And how do folks, to E-Rock's analogy, get over the infighting, sit down and figure out what are some of the best ways to work together and to kind of come together with an action plan to execute?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the way that I want to respond is not in a way that's trying to cause any kind of conflict, but it's kind of, we have to look at the reasoning behind these individuals getting into these positions of power where they're trying to actually make these things happen, right? Like, and I'll give you an example, because a lot of the work that I do right now is in the city of Boston, do a lot of work on gang violence prevention. There's a lot of nonprofit entities in the city of Boston that work to reduce gangs. It's rare that they ever collaborate, communicate, or share information, do any of that. Rather, it's actually, we're kind of in competition because we're competing for this, resource, which is funding, right, to sustain our programming. So oftentimes when it comes to addressing these kind of like very serious systemic social issues, when you have individuals that go in with really good intentions, they kind of get sidetracked by this like infighting, because it's a very, places like Cambridge are very I like to describe them as resource rich, access poor. Right. So there's a lot of people that are doing a whole bunch of, but who's really doing this stuff that's going to make a change in the community. Right. And so I think that there's that infighting, because some of it is, we're competing for these resources, whether it's, battling for a constituency or funding or someone's attention, or, it's we are completely different things that we're in this for, right? So some of us are in it to make a change, and some of us are in it for personal benefit. And that's a reality that we also have to face when we're actually trying to figure out, who to support, who to fund, these kind of things, and who's actually going to, do the things that they say that they're going to do. Right.
Thank you. So Representative Decker, we'll end with you. Hopefully, and part of why we're ending with you is that a lot of this work is rooted in the fact that as much as we want to kind of move the needle today, it has to go through a legislative process to make policy. Not that that's the only change that could be out there. We started this question, we started our tonight off with where do we go now, right? And so I pose to you, how do we get there? What steps do we need? And obviously that can't be answered in a matter of seconds, but also what help do you need from your perch in the work in which you do? So before you answer, I just want to let everyone know that this will be re-aired on 22 City View. Thank you for everyone for coming out. And also to acknowledge the fact that this will also be available through YouTube. So I just wanted to say that and provide the representative to close us out.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for having these conversations. I think first, I also just want to say thank you to school committee member Aisha Wilson, right? She's doing the work of being an elected official who's on a forum, who's just listening. She's just been here for 90 minutes listening, right? So one, it's like we want our elected officials to show up and just listen. I would say what I need is everything we just talked about, right? It's about knowing that electing people is one step in what actually keeps us moving towards the kind of democracy and country whose values actually are represented in the experiences that people actually get to live, because that's not who we are right now. So electing someone, making sure, does that person, do they represent your values? Do they know when somebody tells me that they want to run for office, I say, okay, tell me what you care about, but more importantly, tell me how that will impact, what's your relationship to the community you would impact? What's your relationship to the people who actually would be impacted by your work? Because that means more to me than sort of knowing what the changes you are. Do you know the changes you want to make? Do you know the community who will benefit from those changes? And is that what's driving you to create those changes or advocate for those changes? So I think it's really about, it's keeping in conversation. It's, you know, as an elected official, it's not a static thing. I constantly have to go back and forth and do this check of, am I getting it right? Where am I falling short? Also do the important work of when I have conversations with constituents who might not agree with what I'm doing, and to be able to say, well, let me tell you why I'm doing this, right? So give me the space first to talk to you. And then if you still disagree with me, we're good. But let's have that conversation first. And I think that a lot of elected officials are afraid to do that because there's this nature that somehow, you know, what Iraq said earlier, like, you know, people get elected because, you know, it can be a cult of personality. And if it's a cult of personality and you don't ever have like an honest, transparent conversation with the people who elect you, then they never really know you, you never really know them. And it becomes not about sort of you as a movement together and a voice. So I think it's having conversations is one of the most important things. Understanding what's important to people, why is it important? Understanding both at the individual level and then understanding sort of how does this create systemic changes? So when I pass laws that reduce poverty, I'm very clear. The system is still very broken, or it's still set up for very much what it was supposed to be, to keep people in poverty and keep other people very wealthy. So I've got to do both, eliminate the real hardships that people are experiencing every day as much as I can, but also be working with how do we make those big like systems changes. And that's, there's not one answer. Tony, I watch you on social media, right? You are talking about things that are like 20 different things that are happening that some people dedicate their life to each one of those things. So it's a lot of different things that are happening, having conversations and making sure that the lenses that we're constantly doing any of this work, that we are asking ourselves, if it's value-driven work, what's the impact? Is the impact actually, you know, does it commensurate with the effort? Do we keep going this way? Do we change because the effort is not actually getting us there fast enough? So I don't think that I have an answer that anyone here doesn't, but I think that, you know, having these kinds of conversations and accountability, you know, accountability is a good word. It's an important word. And it's one that it's about, because when you're accountable, it means that you have a deeper understanding and you have reasonable expectations of each other. So that's it. I don't think I have any actually additional wisdom that anyone here doesn't have to offer more than I do. So thank you for doing this, and thanks for having us. And it's really great to see. It's really great to see a couple of young leaders here who are like, you know, we say young. I'm only saying young leaders because you're younger than I am. You're leaders. You're shaping this community already. And Isaac, thanks for wearing the shirt with my name on it. A little bit about you, and I hope to get to know you more. Sounds like you're doing some pretty amazing work, and I've heard from other people who actually are inspired by you. So, and then I'm just going to give a shout out because I know Carolyn Hunter's on here, right? I can't see her face. And I just kind of love that her daughter is just bringing it here. And we talk about like leadership, you know, and yet like the mother of leadership, right here where we're not even seeing or hearing from her, but we clearly are through her daughter and who's come into her own. So
I say.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys. We will be back with you. We know we're going to need you again on here, and we look forward to this monthly series. Look forward to having Carolyn on here where she'll show her face and share her experiences and others. So thank you and good night.